Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On the program this time, we have an original science fiction story written by our very own Jose Munoz.
Neat!
It's called Faster Than Light. Later, I will read a listener-suggested tale called Texas Week, and we also have a collection of events from a haunted antique store in Tucson, Arizona. So grab some popcorn, your favorite beverage, and enjoy this 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by really long organ interludes. Have you ever noticed that I have to talk a lot in these mysteries? Well, that's because 3 of the show's 5 minutes is organ playing. It's really true.
Well, Alice, one more block and you'll behold the Brooks household.
2 whole years, Jim. It just doesn't seem possible it's been so long. You and Dorothy married and with a place of your own.
Yeah, it's true, all right. Only too bad you haven't taken advantage of the old Brooks hospitality sooner.
Well, I'm here now, and I intend having a perfectly wonderful time.
Now, here we are.
Oh, what a charming place this is.
Dorothy's probably on needles and pins waiting for me to get you here. Darling, it's Jim. Here's Alice.
Jim, look.
What? Where?
There on the living room floor. It's Dorothy. Dead.
Mr. Brooks, I'm afraid you and Miss Manning will have to submit to some routine questioning.
Well, I'll be happy to help in any way I can, Inspector.
Thank you, Miss Manning. Now, Mr. Brooks, while we're waiting for some information I phoned for, I want you to tell me exactly what happened this morning.
There's nothing much to tell. Both my wife and I were quite excited, expecting Alice, that is, Miss Manning here, and to visit us from Chicago. I was to wait until she called me at the office.
And you were there all morning?
Yes, until Miss Manning's train arrived and we came out here.
Well, I had written Mrs. Brooks, Inspector, telling her that I'd call Jim at the office as soon as I arrived. The train was an hour later. We could have been here early and maybe have prevented this.
Well, that remains to be seen. Apparently, Mrs. Brooks was sitting here in this chair, putting red polish on her fingernails, when she was shot from behind. The polish is spilled all over the carpet, and she was still holding the tiny brush in her hand. She must have recognized her attacker, and since she did not die instantly, she printed these 3 initials here on the floor with the polish. D.O.C.
D.O.C.? I wish we could tell whose initial she was trying to reveal.
You're sure you don't know anyone whose name would fit that?
Well, positive, I can't.
Why, that's...
Yes, Miss Manning? Can you think of somebody with the initials?
Well, D.O.C. spells Doc, and it's Mr. Brooks's nickname.
Well, it can't be.
Yes, Mr. Brooks?
I haven't been called Doc for over 2 years. It was a nickname I picked up in school. My wife didn't like the name and never used it. Nobody in New York even knows me by the Doc. You've got to believe me, Inspector. It's the truth.
Well, that we'll see. Just a minute. Hello. Yes, Grady? Yes? I see. Well, it's sewed up anyway. Thanks. Well, you both will be happy to know our little murder is solved.
Oh, then it wasn't Doc after all.
No, Miss Manning, it wasn't Doc. I'm arresting you, Miss Manning, for the murder of Dorothy Brooks. Why did the inspector arrest Miss Manning for the murder of Mrs. Brooks? In a moment, we'll hear, but first...
I have to admit, I really don't get this one. I'm thinking that the policeman got some information on that phone call that told him who the murderer was. In fact, I'm betting on it. Oh, and what about that DOC clue? Well, after carefully thinking that one through, I've come to the conclusion that I really don't know.
And And now, back to our story.
How dare you arrest me? I was still on the train.
Your train wasn't late, Miss Manning. That phone call just verified the fact. You came out here, murdered Mrs. Brooks, returned to the station, and called Mr. Brooks to pick you up. But that wasn't what really gave you away, Miss Manning. Too bad you didn't know Mr. Brooks was no longer called Doc when you printed those letters on the carpet. The next time you leave a name as a clue to throw suspicion, you'd better get the name right. But, of course, there won't be a next time, will there, Miss Manning?
See, that phone call was the key. While it turns out that Doc was written to throw away suspicion from the real killer, it was just not enough for me. If only we could have heard both sides of that phone chat. If only they had Skype in the 1940s. Something to think about. This mystery was brought to you by Really Long Oregon Roads. Another great email this week from Jerry Fiddler, who lives and breathes in Chicago, Illinois. Jerry writes, "Hey Ron, listen to the show on Apple Podcasts every week. You are my Friday morning commute, and I have to thank you for making your show exactly 1 hour in length, because that is precisely how long it takes me to get to work. I have a question for you that I've wanted to ask, and it would mean the world to me if you answered it on the air. You have an amazing voice, pardon the pun, and I want you to know how relaxed and soothing you are. You take the frustrating time in traffic and turn it into something else, transporting me to so many different places. My question is this. Actors, voiceover specialists, and even motivational speakers spend a lifetime honing their craft. What is your background or secret? Jerry." Well, Jerry, thank you for this question. I've been accused of being overdramatic, sing-songy, and even monotone. But I'm happy to report that most seem to enjoy my voice. I remember years ago, in the age of the answering machine, I got a wrong number from a girl. Rather than hang up, she went on for about 2 minutes on how much she loved my voice. She asked me to call her back, and we ended going out for about 2 months. It never really went anywhere, but it was a lot of fun. There you have it. All the training I've ever had. I have been a newspaper guy, a counselor for teens, worked in a toy store, a computer store, and spent 17 years as an engineer for a major chip manufacturer. No time for voice lessons or anything along those lines. I do love recording and sharing stories, and I think the passion that you hear comes from that more than anything. I hope that answers your question, Jerry, because it's all I've got. Last week, I introduced you to Alton Chung. I said his first name every which way but the right way. Elton, Alton, and a few other ways, but in fact, it's Alton. My apologies. Anyway, he will be joining us for a special ghost story and storytelling show on April 16th. I'm also excited to say he will be sharing his storytelling talents with us as well. Now, having said all of that, I'm still looking for your scary stories about ghosts, poltergeists, and head-scratchers to fill that show. I have picked out 2 so far, and I need at least 4. The recording date is set for April 9th, so please get your ghost stories in. We really do need them. And now, a message from Audible. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So what am I listening to right now? Interview with the Robot by Lee Bacon. This is an incredibly fun book to listen to. It is an Audible original, which means it has a cast of actors rather than a single narrator. The story is a science fiction adventure that introduces a unique heroine who seeks the truth about herself. Eve looks like an ordinary 12-year-old girl, but there's nothing ordinary about her. Here's a brief clip from the book.
All right, let's begin. This is case file 6409, NYPD 13th Precinct Station, Interrogation Room 2. I'm Petra Amos with Child Welfare Services, and I'm here with... This is the part where you tell me your name.
Eve.
Last name?
I don't have one.
You don't know your last name?
I was never given one.
And where are your parents, Eve?
I don't have parents.
Foster parents?
Don't have those either.
How old are you, Eve?
I appear to be 12 years old.
Appear?
My actual age is complicated.
Are you lying to me?
No, ma'am.
Because if you are, you should know you can get into big trouble for lying to someone in my position.
I understand that, but I'm not lying.
Let's take a step back. Explain to me why you were arrested.
For stealing a shirt.
A men's XL t-shirt with text on the front that reads, "Retired and loving it." Why would a 12-year-old girl even want a shirt like that?
I'm not 12. I just...
Look, 12. Yeah, you said that already. But that's not all you stole, was it?
No, ma'am.
Why don't you tell me exactly what you did to end up here?
Well, so earlier today, I arrived at Big Apple Gifts.
Excuse me, what do you think you're doing? You can't just put that shirt in your backpack. Another shirt? Wow, okay. And now you're just... Yep, you're going for more. Hey, little girl, I'm right here, you know, I can see you. Put down the keychain. Okay, that's it. Security!
I'm looking at an invoice for all the objects you attempted to steal. 6 novelty t-shirts, 2 Statue of Liberty keychains, 1 yellow taxi chew toy for dogs, and 3 pairs of I Heart New York boxer shorts. And you did all this right in front of the clerk, with a security guard standing 10 feet away.
I guess I'm not so great at the whole criminal thing.
Interview with the Robot comes to life with a multicast performance including Aline Stevens as Eve, Ellen Archer as Petra Amos, Jonathan Davis as David Sharp, Ken T. Collins as Emery Sharp, John Hurley as a Boswell employee, Aaron Mallon as a device, robot, and female barista, and Stephen Bell Davis as a store clerk, hotel employee, and an office clerk. This audiobook is so much fun, I had to listen to it in one sitting. The acting is amazing. The story is something that you're going to want to listen to over and over again, and you can own it today. Here's what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories, and you can get Interview with the Robot for free. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
This week we have a story from Tanya Woodall, who lives in Tucson, Arizona. Tanya didn't want to write her story herself, so we hashed it out over a phone call. We have titled this one, The Haunting at Antique Mall. Do ghosts come out of the past? Most people think so. Well then, what more appropriate place than an antique mall? Tanya says that in Tucson we have such a place at the 22nd Street Antique Mall. She should know she's worked there the last 10 years. Here are her stories. The mall has a main store and two-story annex. It was originally built as a furniture store with an office on the second floor of the annex. That area is now a mini museum of sorts. In one corner, an antique typewriter was placed on a 19th century ornate desk. Several customers and employees report hearing that typewriter typing away. But when it's investigated, there's nobody there. The museum mostly contains furniture, chairs, desks, tables, beds, etc. Each morning, the employees straighten up the furniture before opening. Why? Because during the night it all gets rearranged. The chairs are pulled out into the aisles and lamps are placed on the floor. No explanation has ever been found for this, and ghost hunters who have stayed the night have seen absolutely no activity. One afternoon, Tanya was working on a new arrival in the room. She had a radio playing to pass the time. During the day, the volume would increase suddenly. She'd have to walk over and turn it back down. Finally, she got tired of the fun and yelled, "Stop messing with the radio!" After that, it never acted up again. During one Christmas holiday season, the shop was very busy. Tanya and a customer were approaching the doorway into the annex, and both were suddenly frozen in place. The people who were shopping all sped up like in a time warp. It might have only been a few seconds, but it seemed like hours to them. Then everything slowed back down to a normal pace. Tanya said, "We both just stood there for several minutes with dazed look on our faces." Tanya finally turned to the customer and said, "Did you see that?" The customer replied, "What just happened?" One event grabbed the attention of everyone in the store when they heard the loud sound of crashing glass from one of the front booths. They all rushed to the booth, but nothing was amiss. The booth was rented to a dealer who had died a month before. His goods were still there, but he was not. People who knew the man called him the prankster. Perhaps these stories are all imagination, but Tanya and anyone else who spends time at the 22nd Street Antique Mall is sure that the place is haunted. Tanya Woodall, Tucson, Arizona. Well, I have to say I had a great time talking with Tanya, and after doing so, I'm 100% convinced that she's right. That place surely must be haunted. Thank you for your story, Tanya. It truly is amazing. As I said at the top, we have a very special story for you this week. It was sent in by a longtime listener, Jose Munoz. This is his second submission to the show and is a science fiction tale that is epic in scope and told with amazing clarity. In other words, I loved it. I figured it needed a professional touch, so I went to our friend Mark Nelson, who is a professional narrator, to read it for us. The story is titled Faster Than Light and is a lesson in time travel as well as history. I think you're going to love it too. Take it away, Mark.
Faster Than Light 2050 by Jose L. Munoz. Dr. Leah Arez. Leah always loved the sound of that ever since having graduated with honors from MIT with a PhD in physics. She was known as Dr. Leah to her friends and colleagues. Even her parents and grandparents often called her Dr. Leah, as they were so proud of what she had managed to accomplish. Her PhD dissertation was in particle physics, specifically on tachyon particles. Tachyon particles were theoretical particles that always traveled faster than light. They had remained theoretical, until her thesis, that is, because most physicists believed they were inconsistent with the then-known laws of physics, specifically with the speed of light being an upper limit. She can recall her thesis advisor telling her, "Nothing can travel faster than light." Her thesis showed that tachyon particles, tackies as she liked to call them, were in fact consistent with known physical laws. Indeed, she had to invent a new calculus, tensor-temporal vector calculus, in order to prove her point. Dr. Leah and her dissertation advisor were well aware that if her results held up, she'd be on the fast track for a Nobel Prize. Dr. Leah Arez, Nobel Prize laureate. She liked the sound of that. With over 850 Nobel Prizes having been awarded, only 51 have been granted to women. She'd make it 52. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about tackies is that they might be able to affect time travel. Specifically, to be able to travel backward in time. Of course, this would only be possible if they could be harvested. While Leah's dissertation had shown that they could exist, there was no guarantee they did exist. Dr. Leah, had always been fascinated with time travel. Dr. Leah loved movies, and her favorite movie genre was science fiction, of course, with time travel movies being her favorite subgenre. In particular, Back to the Future was her favorite movie of all time. The whole concept of being able to travel back in time and perhaps changing history captivated her every waking moment. Is it possible? What would it do if one were to do so? How would the paradox of traveling back to a time before your grandfather was born, and then somehow preventing his birth, change things? If one did that, then your father would not be born, which would mean you would not exist, and thereby not have been able to travel back in time to prevent the original birth. Bingo, paradox. The whole thing could give one a headache. The latest thinking on the subject is that a parallel world would branch off from that point in time, a multiverse. But if that were true, would any change result in a multiverse? A parallel universe similar to our own but not exactly the same? Think of time as a river. You throw a small pebble into the river, it wouldn't alter its course. However, were you to build a dam, you'd surely change the river's course. An example might help at this time. Suppose Leah traveled back in time and remembered to bring along an umbrella on a day she can recall she got drenched in a spring downpour. Would that result in a multiverse? Wouldn't seem as if a whole multiverse would need to be spun off for something as benign as that. No harm, no foul. On the other hand, if the assassination of President Lincoln were to be somehow prevented, such an event would surely be significant enough to result in a new multiverse. Or maybe the whole idea of multiverses is all wrong. Maybe such a change would affect all events and future history of our current world. But then again, would we even be aware of it? 2050. For the past 2 years, Dr. Leah has been working as a research fellow at the Large Hadron Collider, LHC, at CERN in Switzerland, courtesy of her thesis advisor who was instrumental in making it happen. She felt that if she was going to make any further progress on her work on tackies, LHC was the only place where she'd be able to further her research. In addition, she had received an award from the National Science Foundation, NSF, that enabled her to conduct her own individual research project. Using the NSF funds, she was able to build a magnetic bottle capable of capturing and containing tackies. Her research had progressed to the point where she now knew what a tachyon particle signature looked like in the traces produced at the LHC. Traces are tracks that highlight the paths particles traverse. That, along with other information gathered, enabled scientists to identify subatomic particles. The trick is that you have to have some idea of what to look for. Dr. Leah now had an excellent idea of what tacky should look like. Further, with her magnetic bottle, she would be able to actually capture one. More than one? After the most recent firing of the LHC, she did just that. She had been able not only to confirm the existence of tachyon particles, hello Nobel, but was able to capture 5 tackies in her magnetic bottle. To celebrate the occasion, she rewarded herself by having chocolate truffles and some pistachio ice cream, her 3 favorite indulgences consisting of dark chocolate, ice cream, and nuts, before hunkering down to confirm her results. Right now, she was too excited to do the deep thinking required. The LHC was scheduled to undergo major upgrades and renovation that would take at least a year. She decided to request some much-earned and deserved time off so she could identify future steps and develop time travel protocols. Should she announce her discovery to the world, or first explore what can be done with tackies? Is it possible to use them for the purpose of time travel? If they cannot be used to affect time travel, then what can they be used for? The scientist in her, along with her adventurous nature, had to know. She decided to go back home and see her mom in the Bronx. She hadn't seen her in some time and genuinely missed her as they were very close. She gets into her personal transport vehicle, PTV, and enters the transatlantic magnetic underocean vacuum tube that would take her directly to the Bronx. The tube is part of the Worldwide Advanced Exascale Transportation AET system. During the 2-hour trip, she develops the following. 1. Be absolutely sure of what to expect before releasing any tacky. She wouldn't wish to be responsible for an end-of-world scenario. Cue end-of-world organ music. 2. Using her tensor temporal vector calculus, she was able to determine that if she could travel back in time, her visit could only be for 89 minutes, just under 1.5 hours. Why was that? She did find it fascinating that 89 is a member of both the Fibonacci sequence as well as a prime number. At one time, she thought of being a math teacher. 3. Her calculus also showed that the further back in time one wished to traverse, the more tachyon particles would be required. 4. One is traveling in time, not space, so you have to be at the correct spatial coordinates if you wish to do anything. Even B-grade time travel movies manage to get that right. 5. She had to develop some mechanism that would permit her to dial in a specific time frame. No on or about would suffice, as she would only have 89 minutes to accomplish any task. 6. She had to dress appropriately for the period. She thought about the need for carrying the correct money for the time period, but with only 89 minutes, she couldn't think of a scenario where money would come into play. Imagine showing up in 1850 with a Lincoln $5 bill. 7. Finally, and this is more of a question, what happens at the end of the 89 minutes? Do you remain in the past as some kind of ghost-like entity? Do you just pop back into your current time? Well, hopefully not exactly at the time you did your travel, otherwise your time travel would repeat itself. Think of the movie Groundhog Day. Will the return trip incur the cost of additional tackies? Now, all she had to do was to build the mechanism that would permit her to travel back in time, as well as a mechanism that would permit her to release the required number of tackies. After working day and night, in between the fabulous home-cooked meals her mom would prepare, Leah finally finished it, her very own flux capacitor. She named it after the device in Back to the Future. Using it, she could not only release the required number of tachyons, but also select year, month, day, and time. Now, all she had to decide was where and when. Well, since she was already home, she thought she may as well do something there in the Bronx. She recalled thinking about the downpour she was caught in that resulted in her catching a really bad cold. She asked her mom if she could recall exactly when that happened. Leah: Mom, didn't I get really sick when I was just a kid? Leah's mom: Yes, you did. But what brought that up? Leah: Oh, nothing really. I was just thinking that I never really got so sick I had to be hospitalized. So it was just a cold, huh? She hated having to lie to her. Leah's mom. Well, let's see. It was on March 1st, and you were just 11 years old. I'll never forget the date because of how sick you were. You got caught in a downpour on your way to school. I felt so guilty. Leah's mom had provided all of the information Leah required. Her mom told her that it was on March 1st, so it wasn't officially spring yet. Leah would have sworn it was in spring. It must have been a mild day. And that Leah was just 11 years old, so that would make it 2030. And Leah had just left the apartment to go to school, so that would make it 7:30 a.m. Great. She had all the information she required, place and exact date and time. Fortunately, people didn't dress too differently in 2050 as they did in 2030, so she wouldn't stand out. But how does she tell me, her, us, about the coming rain? She felt she couldn't just speak to herself, how odd does that sound, as her mom always warned her about speaking to strangers. She was also against making physical contact with her younger self. If the same person from two different time coordinates came into contact, what would happen? She recalled such a thing happening in the movie Time Cop, resulting in a time event singularity not ending well for either party. She remembered her mom had a communication device back in 2030, something called a smartphone. By the standards of 2050, smart wouldn't be the term that had come to mind. Not so smartphone? Luckily, her mom was somewhat of a pack rat and still had the smartphone she used in 2030. Leah found it, quickly learned how to use it. Interesting, they used something called phone numbers, and was able to get her quantum communicator to mimic her mom's smartphone behavior. Her plan was to use the communicator to send a message to her mom's smartphone, alerting her to the unexpected downpour. All was set. Leah was ready. Here goes. 2030. Leah had programmed her communicator so that it'd act as a link to the flux capacitor. She also included a big red enter button to play homage to the movie she loved. The trip would cost her 1 tachyon particle, 1 tachy. She packed her flux capacitor into her smiley backpack and biked over to where she lived in 2030. Not quite Back to the Future's DeLorean, but it'll have to do. While Leah could have walked to her childhood residence, she loved walking and faithfully did so every morning. She decided she'd bike there in case she needed to make a quick getaway. Upon arriving at her 2030 location, she used her communicator to translate the address her mom gave her into the correct spatial coordinates. Leah then proceeded to enter the appropriate time coordinates. To prevent any accidental triggering of the flux capacitor, she had programmed her communicator so that it'd not only respond to her voice, but also require two-factor authentication, DNA verification in addition to retina scan. Press the button, and nothing. Other than a very bright flash and a slight popping sound, she thought nothing happened. She didn't feel any different. She didn't see things slowly run backward like in the 1960 movie The Time Machine. Her device didn't work. Her discovery was no discovery at all. Bye-bye Nobel Prize. But wait, things look different. Those don't look like the 2050 transports she's familiar with parked out in the street. In addition, people were actually guiding their own vehicles, steering them. She found that to be so quaint. By 2050, everyone had autonomous transports. She found that the air smelled foul and wouldn't be surprised if those vehicles used fossil fuel to get around. Yuck. She checked her communicator. March 1, 2030. The time is 7:15 a.m. She had set it just a little earlier to make sure she didn't miss herself. She hid behind a vehicle. What do they call them? Cars? She wanted to observe what would happen, but did not wish little Leah to see her grown-up self. Sure enough, at precisely 7:30 a.m., boy, her mom was good, out-bounced little Leah. But wait, she's not carrying an umbrella or a raincoat. What happened? 11-year-old Leah turned to head off to school, but just as she did, Dr. Leah saw her mom, her 20-year younger-looking mom, open up a window and call out to little Leah. She told Leah to come up and grab her raincoat and umbrella, as she just received a warning on her smartphone of a pending storm. Yes, it works. Time travel is possible, but what has she changed? Could this minor correction result in some time anomaly down the road that changes future history? She'll have to get used to that term. Would the same Leah still exist in 2050? She followed little Leah walk to school and greet her friends. She even overheard her friends ask little Leah how did she know it was going to rain today. Cute. 2050. Then pop, flash, Dr. Leah was pulled back to 2050. Thankfully. She didn't feel any different, except that now she had two memories of that time. One in which she was caught in a downpour and consequently caught a bad cold, and another where she wore a raincoat and carried an umbrella. She couldn't wait to bike back home and talk to her mom. She was able to steer a conversation to the rain time frame, asking her mom about the time she got caught in rain and got a severe cold. Her mom got a puzzled look on her face and said that something like that could have happened, but did not, as she was able to call her back home to bring along an umbrella and raincoat. Where did Leah get such an idea? Leah only smiled, thinking to herself, "Yes." Well, that sure was interesting. She was indeed able to travel back in time and effect a change. A minor change to be sure, but a change nevertheless. However, maybe she was now living in a parallel multiverse. In one universe she caught a bad cold, and in this universe she had not. But that wouldn't make sense because she recalls both events. If she was living in a parallel universe, surely she would not be aware of both events. Leah had convinced herself that time interventions of a minor nature appeared to be benign. Good. But what about time interventions that were not so minor? Interventions that should change the course of future history. What, if you will permit the analogy, would happen if she built a dam across the river of time? Leah had 4 heroes she greatly admired. Elizabeth Pendleton, America's first woman president. In addition, she was a Nobel laureate in recognition of her achieving peace in the Middle East. Albert Einstein, what physicist doesn't admire the greatest mind ever to have lived? Alan Turing, a mathematician who never did get the recognition he so rightly deserved, and Abraham Lincoln, in Leah's opinion, America's greatest president. Of the 4, intervening in Lincoln's assassination would most likely result in a readily observable effect. However, her computation showed that it would require 2 tachyon particles to travel back to 1865, the year of Lincoln's assassination. While she had 4 tackies remaining. She did, didn't she? She quickly opened up her backpack and checked the magnetic bottle. There were only 3 particles remaining. Apparently, the trip back to 2050 from 2030 cost her a tacky. Well, so much for going to 1865. She thought of another president that was killed and whose life expired long before the world might have been able to realize his full potential, President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in November 1963. She went into her immersion room. From her museum visits with her mom, she knew that people used to sit around watching 2-dimensional images. Immersion rooms put you in the center of the scene with 3-dimensional images all around you. She studied the Kennedy assassination and found that President Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, by Lee Harvey Oswald at precisely 12:30 p.m. She'll have to bear in mind that Texas is on Central Time. Dr. Leah's calculations found that the trip would only cost her 1 tachyon particle. She had 3 remaining. With 1 required for the return trip, she'll be able to make it happen with 1 particle to spare. Leah used her personal transport to enter AET's Continental Magnetic Vacuum Tube in the Bronx, arriving in Dallas, Texas, 2050 in an hour. She stayed at a hotel as near as possible to Dealey Plaza, after first making sure it existed back in 1963. She doesn't need to kill Oswald, just delay him, detain him past 12:30 p.m. on November 22, 1963. Studying images from 1963, she obtained clothes that were consistent with those worn in that time period, a dress to be exact. She didn't much care for dresses, preferring to wear denims. Her plan was simple. Research showed that at noon Oswald was eating lunch at the Texas Book Depository cafeteria. She brought along a small bottle of Visine, aware that even a couple of drops will result in severe diarrhea. All she needed to do was slip a few drops into Oswald's coffee while he was having lunch. He'll rush to the men's room, and she'll proceed to lock him in, keeping him there until past 12:30 p.m. Simple. Easy peasy. Leah walks over to Dealey Plaza, still looking very much as it did in 1963. Her smiley backpack might look a little odd in 1963, but so be it. Modern backpacks would not be invented for another 4 years. She programmed the flux capacitor for November 22, 1963, 11:45 a.m. Again, she wanted some slack time just in case. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she's about to give the execute command and press enter to transport herself to 1963. But nothing appears to have happened. Perhaps she spoke too soon. It's not that nothing has changed, but rather that nothing is moving. The personal transports, cars, of 1963 are frozen in place. People are not moving. Birds are not flying. The wind is not blowing. It is dead silent. She then sees a bright red streak that stops right in front of her. An image is projected, and it's an image of Dr. Leah. But not 2050 Dr. Leah. Rather, this Dr. Leah is perhaps some 20 years older. The image speaks. She doesn't really speak, but rather it's more like 2050 Leah knows what 2070 Leah is thinking. 2070 Dr. Leah. Leah, me. Oh, you know what I mean. I have intervened from the future to warn you that if you intervene in the assassination of President Kennedy, it will result in catastrophic changes to future history. 2050 Dr. Leah, still with a stunned look on her face. Catastrophic changes? Huh? What do you mean? Wait a minute. You're me. Or rather, I'm you. Whatever? 2070 Dr. Leah. I cannot give you details, as it is forbidden by the time travel laws that you yourself develop in the future. Just do not proceed. 2050 Dr. Leah. But, I made a change in 2030, and that appears to have gone okay. The only thing that happened is that I didn't catch a cold. 2070 Dr. Leah. You, our civilization as we know it, were fortunate that small change did not have a ripple effect throughout time. We were fortunate. Civilization was lucky. 2050 Dr. Leah. Oh. So our discovery is of no use? No time travel? No Nobel? 2070 Dr. Leah. Yes, of course tachyon particles can be used to affect time travel. You've already shown that. But they mustn't be used for that. It turns out, and I've been cleared by the Time Council to tell you this, that tackies, as we love to call them, can be used for space travel by injecting them in Einstein-Rosen bridges or wormholes. 2050 Dr. Leah, smiling. I never thought of that. 2070 Dr. Leah, also smiling. You will. By the way, I've also been cleared to let you know that you will receive 2 Nobel Prizes, both in physics. One for your work on tachyon particles, and the other for their application to wormholes. Then, as if resuming a movie that had been paused, everything around her returned back to normal. 2050. What was it that she just experienced? Was it a hallucination? Could she really have been visited by her future self? She opened up her backpack to check if everything was there and found that she now had 0 tachyon particles remaining. That's odd. She had 3 this morning. She felt something else in a side pocket of the backpack. She unzipped the side pocket to find a book. A paperback book. They haven't printed those in 20 years. She took the book out. Black Holes and Wormholes by Jose Munoz, published in 2025. How did that get there? Then Dr. Leah Arez, future Nobel laureate, smiles. The end of Faster Than Light 2050 by Jose L. Munoz.
What a great story, and I want to thank Jose for sending it in. This is the second story that he has sent in. The first can be found in episode number 375 and was titled An Encounter While Biking. Jose is originally from New York City, now residing in Virginia. He is currently retired from federal service, where he last was a chief technology officer for one of the science agencies. He says, "I love the science fiction genre, both books and movies, especially time travel stories, hence the inspiration for the storyline. I recently became a great-granduncle to a niece who was about to celebrate her first birthday. So I wrote this story with her in mind, thinking that it would be a novel gift. Loving science, I thought it'd be nice to write something that might inspire her in the future to achieve something great. And what's greater than a Nobel Prize? In addition to movies and books, I enjoy riding my bike, and that was the inspiration for my short story, An Encounter While Biking, that combines science fiction with my love of biking." Jose went on to say that he is a longtime listener of Ron's Amazing Stories and first found us years ago when I did a spot on Jim Harold's Campfire to read a story. He says, "I've been hooked happily since then. Keep up the great work." Well, Jose, I say to you, keep up the good work and please send us more of your stories. You are a talented writer. I also want to thank Mark Nelson. Mark did the narration of Jose's story, and I think he did a pretty fantastic job. Mark has recorded over 70 professional audiobooks, including crime fiction, science fiction, horror, nonfiction, histories, and classics for Audible. He's also done over 150 recordings for LibriVox.org, which is amazing. You can find out more about Mark and his work at markdouglasnelson.com. Thanks again, Jose, for sharing your story, and to you, Mark, for reading it.
As read by Amazing Stories, read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have a story that was brought to my attention by Brent Heridian. You might recognize that name from last week's podcast. He wrote us a question. The story is from Fantastic Universe, January of 1954. It is a short story that Brent found on Project Gutenberg that he thought would be good for the show. I agreed with him, but I couldn't find an audio version. So I'm going to read it for you now. It's titled Texas Week by Albert Herrnhuter. And yes, I'm aware that is a very silly name. The black sedan sped along the wide and straight street, came to a smooth stop in front of a clean white house. A small man got out of the car and walked briskly to the front door. Reaching out with a pink hand, he pressed the doorbell with one well-manicured finger. The door was answered by the housewife. She was wearing a white blouse, green skirt, and a green apron trimmed with white. Her feet were tucked into orange slippers. Her blonde hair was done up in a neat bun. She was dressed appropriately, just as the government had ordered for that week. The man said, You are Mrs. Christopher Nest? There was a trace of anxiety in her voice as she answered,
Yes, and you are?
My name is Maxwell Hanstark. As you may already know, I am the official psychiatrist for this district. My appointment will last until the end of this year. Mrs. Nest invited him in. They stepped into a clean living room. At one end was the television set. The other end were several chairs. There was nothing between the set and the chairs except for a large gray rug which stretched from wall to wall. They walked to the chairs and sat down. Now, what's the matter with your husband, Mrs. Nest? Mrs. Nest reached into a large bowl and absently picked up a piece of stale popcorn. She daintily placed it in her mouth and chewed thoughtfully before she answered.
I wish I knew. All he does all day is sit in the backyard and stare at the grass. He insists that he's standing on top of a cliff.
Hanstark took out a small pad and a short ballpoint pen. He wrote something down before he spoke again. Is he violent? Did he get angry when you told him that there was no cliff? Mrs. Ness was silent for a moment. A second piece of popcorn joined the first. Hanstark's pen was poised above the pad.
No, he didn't get violent.
Hanstark wrote as he asked the next question. Just what was his reaction?
He said I must be crazy.
Those were his exact words?
No, he said that I was...
She thought for a minute.
Loco. Yes, that was the word.
Loco?
Yes, he said it just like those cowboys do on the television.
Hanstark looked puzzled. Perhaps you better tell me more about this. When did he first start acting this way? Mrs. Nelson glanced up at the television set and then back to Hanstark.
It was right after Texas Week. You remember they showed all those cowboy pictures?
Hanstark nodded.
Well, he stayed up every night watching them. Some nights he didn't go to sleep at all, even after the set was off. He just sat in one of the chairs, just staring at the screen. This morning when I got up, he wasn't in the house. I looked all over, but I couldn't find him. I was just about ready to phone the police when I glanced out the window into the backyard and saw him.
What was he doing?
He was just sitting there in the middle of the yard, staring. I went out and tried to bring him into the house. He told me that he had to watch for someone. When I asked him what he was talking about, he told me I was crazy. That's when I phoned you, Mr. Hanstark.
Very wise move, Mrs. Nest. And will you show me where your husband is, right now? She nodded her head, and they both got up from the chairs. They walked through the dining room and kitchen. On the back porch, Hanstark came to a halt. You better stay here, Mrs. Nest. He walked to the door and opened it.
Mr. Hanstark,
Mrs. Nest called. Hanstark turned and saw her standing next to an automatic washing machine. Yes?
Please be careful.
Hanstark smiled. I shall be, Mrs. Nest. He walked out the door and down 3 concrete steps. Looking a little to his right, he saw a man squatted on his heels. He walked up to the man. Are you Mr. Christopher Nest? The man looked up and stared at Husk for a moment. Yep, he answered. And then he turned and stared at the grass again. May I ask what you're doing? Guarding the pass. Hanstark scribbled something in his notebook. And why are you guarding the pass? Nest rose to his feet and stared down at Hanstark. Just what you asking all these questions for, stranger? Hanstark saw Nest was bigger, and he decided to play along for a while. After all, strategy. I'm just interested in your welfare, Mr. Nest. Nest shrugged his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sack of tobacco and some paper. Holding a piece of paper in one hand, he carefully poured a little tobacco onto it. In one quick movement, he rolled the paper and tobacco into a perfect cylinder. He put the sack of tobacco and the paper back into his pocket and took out a wooden kitchen match. He scraped it to life on the sole of his shoe and applied the flame to the tip of the cigarette. He puffed it into life and threw the match away. It burned for a few moments in the moist grass and then went out. A thin trail of smoke rose from it, and then it was gone. "Why are you guarding the pass?" Hanstark asked again. Nest resumed his crouch on the grass. "News is around that Dirty Dan, the cattle rustler, is going to try to steal some of my cattle." He patted an imaginary holster at his side. "I aims to stop him." Hanstark thought for a moment. Strategy. He must use strategy. "Mr. Ness." He waited until Nest had turned to him. "Mr. Nest, what would you say if I told you that there was no pass down there?" "Why, shucks, partner, I'd say you'd been chewing some loco weed." "And if I could prove it?" Ness answered after a moment's pause. "Why, I guess I'd be local then." Hanstark thought that it was going to be easy. "Mr. Nest, it is a well-known fact that no one can walk in mid-air. Is that not true?" Nest took a deep drag of his cigarette and blew the smoke out his nostrils. "Sure." "Well then, if I were to walk out above your pass, you'd have to admit that there is no pass." "Reckon so." Hanstark began to walk in the direction of Nest's cliff. Nest jumped to his feet and grabbed the official psychiatrist by the arm. "What are you trying to do?" Nest said angrily. "Kill yourself?" Hanstark shook free of his grasp. "Mr. Nest, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm merely going to walk in that direction." He pointed to where the cliff was supposed to be. "To you, it will look as if I were walking in midair." Nest dropped his hands to his sides. "Shucks, I don't care if you kill yourself. It's just that it's liable to make the cattle nervous." Hanstark gave him a cold glare and began to walk. He took 3 paces and stopped. "You see, Mr. Nest, there is no cliff." Nest looked at him and laughed. "You just take one more step and you'll find out that there's a cliff." Hanstark took another step, a long one. His face bore a surprised look as he disappeared beneath the grass. His screams could be heard for a moment before he landed on the rocks below. Nest walked up to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the mangled body. He took off his hat in respect. "That little feller had some guts," he then added. "Poor little feller." He put his hat back on and looked down at the entrance of the valley. A horse and rider appeared from behind several rocks. "Dirty Dan!" Nest exclaimed. He reached down and picked up his rifle. I hope you liked my telling of the story. It was actually pretty fun to read. But what does it all mean? Was Christopher's reality stronger than Maxwell Hanstark's? Who can say? There are clues in this story that this was a dystopian society. People were forced to live under the thumb of government rule. Did Christopher find his escape? I think I'll leave it at that and let you decide. Meeting the little man who isn't there is rated a horrendous experience, but discovery of the man that is there may even be worse. My thanks to Bent for sharing this story, and to Project Gutenberg, who confirmed that it was in fact in the public domain. That was just episode number 424. I have to thank Jerry Fiddler, Tanya Woodall, Jose Munoz, Mark Nelson, and Ben Teridian for helping out today. Wouldn't have been possible without you guys. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find an amazing number of links that should fit every need. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it. And please subscribe, leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. This is what makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.